This is the lecture for the struggle for North America, and we're talking about the kind of the beginning part of the 18th century, the 1700s. And we're going to start by talking about world wars in the 18th century. Now, we tend to think that there are only two world wars, World War I and World War II, but there's actually been 9 world wars. And in some way, shape, or form, we have been involved in all of them. Uh, the ones that we're going to talk about here, we played a minor role in, other than the French and Indian War, but we have had some sort of involvement in all of them. And so, what we need to kind of focus on are the ones that are going to eventually end salutary neglect and put us on the road to revolution between us and Britain. All right, so some kind of common themes as we talk about these world wars in the 18th century. All of the wars are going to involve Britain and France, and they are fighting for world supremacy. And it is a duel over competing visions of mercantilism. Remember, they believe that if that the world's wealth was finite, and that if their rival got more, then they got less. So the 1700s is really a long, drawn out battle between the two for world supremacy. Really, all of them, other than maybe the King William's War, which kind of ends in a stalemate, but all of them really end in British victory. And each of these have a chapter in North America, really the Caribbean, but then they also have battles going on in Europe and various colonies around the world. So they truly are world wars. But in terms of what we need to know, we don't care about places like India or Gibraltar necessarily. What we need to know is that by the time that 1763 is here, that the British, they have kicked France really out of North America. And east of the Mississippi River, the British now control what we would call today the United States, and really, for the most part, Canada as well. They are going to marginalize the Spanish east of the Mississippi River, and really, this is going to marginalize the Native American groups as well. And so, really, this is a big victory for the British, but it really comes at a cost to them, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, all of these wars, they do, like I said, they do have a chapter of war in America, and most of these are minor skirmishes and minor battles compared to the greater theater of war that's going on in Europe and the rest of the world. But in all of these wars, you have colonists who are trying to gain and obtain more land, and they to do so, they are going to have to defeat the French that are involved in the fur trade out in the frontier. And then the natives, they're just kind of caught in the middle. And so really the natives, they're trying to play off the British against the British against the French, and they're trying to side with whichever one they think is going to win. So if I'm a Native American group and I see that the British are winning, then I'm going to try to ally with them. If I feel like the French are going to win, then I'm going to ally with them. To the natives, the French pose less of a threat. The French aren't really trying to colonize. They're not really trying to take their land. And, they do business with the French. And so really, if you're a native, you kind of want the French to win. But it's pretty clear that the English are, or at least it seems like the British are the stronger side. So in all these wars, for us, the King George's War, the King William's War, the Queen Anne's War, the French and Indian War, they all end with the British winning. And so, they become this world superpower, and really, they rule a lot of the world, and they control, by this point, 3/4 of the world's human beings. They control most of the strategic geopolitical hotspots of the world. And but to control all of this area, it took a lot of money to do so. They invested three-quarters of their income as a country into supporting a military and specifically a navy, and that cost a lot of money. And so by 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, they have racked up a tremendous amount of debt that it took to achieve this victory. And that's going to involve us because they're going to start figuring out which parts of their empire need to contribute more to the cause, so to speak. And that's going to mean more taxes for us, taxes that we haven't been having to pay. We've enjoyed the benefits of the empire, the protection that the British Army bestowed upon us, but we really haven't had to pay that much for that. And so that's going to change in 1763. And that's where we start to see the seeds of mistrust beginning to be planted between the British and American colonies. Really, even through quite a bit of the French and Indian War, nobody had ever in the colonies really thought that American independence was something that was really going to happen or even wanted to happen. Most people that were in the British colonies enjoyed being British subjects and thought of themselves as British, certainly not as something different, at least at that point. But because of all the wars, it's going to lead to things that are going to cause change. Okay, some notable wars during this time, and I really don't think AP needs you to know too much about them. The King William's War, the Queen Anne's War. The only thing probably notable in the Queen Anne's War that you would need to know is the Treaty of Utrecht. And in the Treaty of Utrecht, this is where we see land start to be taken from the French up in what we would call today Canada. So Nova Scotia or Acadia, Newfoundland, these are things that are taken from France and given to Great Britain. And, they're going to continue to fight over these things really until 1763. The King George's War, you can see there in the 1740s, ends with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And again, you have a situation where at the end of the war, colonists in New England had worked with or fought with British colonists, to take over the stronghold of Louisbourg, which you can see the battle in our picture down in the bottom right. And they actually won. They took Louisbourg from the French, and then as politics got involved, the British end up giving giving Louisbourg back to the French, at least temporarily. And that really upset the colonists. They had fought, and many people had died to try to obtain Louisbourg. And so there you kind of see the beginnings of mistrust between the two sides. But really that mistrust would not be fully realized until after the French and Indian War, during and after the French and Indian War. Okay, so as of 1713, after the Treaty of Utrecht, this is what North America looked like in terms of territorial claims. You can see that northern Canada, which there really wasn't much up there, that was kind of loosely controlled by the British. But then the heart of Canada, the southern part, and more importantly, the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, the Great Lakes area where the heart of the fur trade was. This is what the French controlled as of 1713. You can see that the British had control over, the what we call the 13 colonies area, and then the Spanish had the Southwest, and then they also had Florida at this point. Okay, kind of the deciding battle of all the world wars in the 18th century was known to us as the French and Indian War, but then it becomes a much broader war, a world war, a true world war, and the rest of the world kind of knows this as a 7 Years' War. So when I talk about the French and Indian War, just know that I'm also talking about the 7 Years' War, and probably if you took AP World History, you learned about the 7 Years' War, and really in that sense, the French and Indian War is kind of a minor skirmish. But to us, the French and Indian War is a very impactful, deciding war in terms of what would become the United States. All right, so the major cause of the French and Indian War is going to be land. Fight over land and fight over the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes area. But what we want to think of is that, we're expanding. There's frontier settlers that want more land. There's tobacco plantation owners that want more land. And so when we think of the main cause of the French and Indian War, it's land. And it's land in what we would call today Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio. Now, the British at this point, they almost kind of want a fight to happen. They want to get the French out of here, out of this area. And so they send a young colonel, a 22-year-old by the name of George Washington. And they send him with instructions to talk to the French and tell them basically just, you guys need to vacate. You need to vacate your forts. You need to get out of the Ohio River Valley. And it doesn't go well. Washington ends up getting captured, and luckily the French let him go. But the message is clear: the French aren't going anywhere. And so this incites people back in Parliament to, hey, we need to get these people out, and look what they did to us. And so somebody like William Pitt, who's a rising member in the British Parliament, he influences Parliament to want to start a war. And so, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, it starts in America, and it starts really in the Ohio River Valley. And if you kind of want to say that George Washington helped start the French and Indian War, that you wouldn't be far off from the truth, because the first shots were fired involving him. Okay, so who are on sides? Well, early on, definitely the British and the American colonists, they're fighting with each other. It's kind of weird to think about that in about 25 years, they're going to be fighting against each other. But during the French and Indian War, the British and the colonists are fighting together. On the opposite side, you have the French and really the Native Americans. The Iroquois had been on the side of the British, but the first 2 years of the war go really badly for the colonists and the British, and the Iroquois ended up siding with the French, which ended up being a big mistake for them, because obviously the French are going to lose. There are 3 distinct stages of the French and Indian War. And so the war starts in 1754, and you could say from about 1754 to 1757, the French are winning. And that's when the Iroquois kind of jump sides. They go to the French, and it looks really bad. In fact, General Braddock, one of the British commanders, a British general, he dies in the Battle of Fort Duquesne. And so it's looking pretty bad for the first couple of years, until 1757, when William Pitt takes over as Prime Minister of Parliament. And he just kind of reorganizes. He figures out a way to get the colonists more invested in wanting to fight alongside the British. And, he helps and subsidizes the war effort and just really saves the war. So, and when Fort Duquesne eventually gets taken over, it gets renamed Fort Pitt. And that's what we all know today as Pittsburgh. And so William Pitt, he starts that second stage and reorganizes the war effort and really saves the British and the colonists during the French and Indian War. And it's during that time that we really have the greatest battles that we have in North America. And probably the greatest of those battles is the Battle of Quebec. And when the Battle of Quebec is won, and then consequently the Battle for Montreal as well. Those are 2 major battles that are fought really in that southern Canadian area that we would call Canada today. But really, those 2 battles, they win it for England and win it for the colonists. And really by 1760, for the most part, our part in the war is done. And then from the third kind of stage really involves more Britain fighting in India. They end up taking over India. They'll end up getting Gibraltar, which they still actually hold today, from Spain. And it's a big victory for Britain by 1763. Okay, here you can see the map. Like I said, if you look over to Pennsylvania, what we call Pennsylvania today, there's the early fighting in 1754, 1755. And then as William Pitt takes over in 1757, then that's where the British have the greatest amount of success. And so I want to point you up to the St. Lawrence River, where you see 1759, the Battle of Quebec, the Battle of Louisbourg in 1758 over there east of Nova Scotia, and then kind of culminating in 1760 in the Battle for Montreal. And those were all very big British victories, and it leads to the not only the French defeat, but also spells bad news for the Native Americans kind of caught up in the middle of this. Okay, so we'll talk about impacts, but here's what a map is going to look like after 1754. And so, after 1763. So if we take a look at the beginning, so this is 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War. You notice a lot of green on there. And then, after this, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Then the green is basically kicked off. And so you kind of go from having this huge French presence to now the British have taken over, and really anything east of the Mississippi River is the British. And to some degree, the Spanish have been marginalized too, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay. During this time, we actually have some, things going on the frontier where the Iroquois are feeling threatened, and the British actually invite the Iroquois to Albany, New York, along with colonial leaders, and they get together, and this meeting has been called the Albany Congress in 1754. And it doesn't lead to a lot in terms of settling differences between the French, the Native Americans, and the colonists and the British, but it does kind of set the stage for Americans kind of coming together, and this didn't happen very often at this time. What comes out of this is a proposed plan called the Albany Plan, and it was proposed by Ben Franklin. We know Ben Franklin as one of our leading Enlightenment thinkers, and he will be crucial when we get to the independence movement later. But he called for a plan of colonial defense and unity, and he even called for a kind of a rough kind of intercolonial government where representatives from the various colonies would get together to talk about defense and talk about native relations with all the colonies. And so it was really a crude form of national government. Now, eventually, it's going to be rejected by all the colonies. It's going to be rejected by, the British, because the British don't want the Americans to kind of think of themselves as independent. They don't want to think of themselves as a country. They really want them to be decentralized, and they don't want them to unite. The assemblies don't want this either, because for the most part, most of the assemblies, they love having their independence. They don't want a national government of any kind telling them what to do. And so Franklin's Albany Plan is rejected. Now, AP, every once in a while, they'll throw this image up, and we just need to know that this was created by Franklin's paper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. You can see the join or die. You've probably seen this sometime. But it represents the various colonies, and basically it's propaganda saying, hey, look, we need to join together, or, we can't exist. All right. Okay, finishing up here, the impacts of the French and Indian War. As soon as Native Americans realize that they've chosen the wrong side, they chose the French, they're going to lose, they know that the British have won, and they know that that's going to lead to a colonial rush towards their land. They feel like they need to make a last kind of ditch effort. And so one of the chiefs of the Pontiac Indians, of the Ottawa Indians, Chief Pontiac, he gets the Ottawas along with several of the other tribes, and they band together in sort of a native confederacy, and they launch a massive assault on frontier forts all along in the Ohio River Valley, along the Appalachian line, and even kind of getting close to some of the colonies in places like Massachusetts. And hundreds of frontiersmen die. And, really, at least initially, it's a successful rebellion. However, as we know, the natives, even though they have initial success, their time is running out. And so to restore law and order, British soldiers go out and they establish and maintain a line of protection. The rebellion is put down, and the natives are really marginalized. It's not successful in the long run. And so to kind of maintain law and order, the British create the so-called Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 roughly was a line that ran the peak of the Appalachian Mountains, in which that the settlers, the colonials, were supposed to say east of. They were not supposed to be able to settle lands west of. And that, that was designed not only to create, to make sure that there was peace, but also because the British knew they were responsible for the protection of the colonists, and they didn't want to have to pay to go out into the wilderness to protect these people. And, the colonists resent this. They resent not being able to go west of that line. And so this is going to create tension between the colonists and the British. Now, remember that, as I said earlier, the British, they end up winning these world wars, and the war of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War was a huge victory in terms of world domination, of mercantilism, for world supremacy for the British, but it cost them a lot of money. Now their empire is even larger, and now they have to govern it, they have to maintain it, they have to protect it. And the British, they've really upset the Spanish, they've really upset the French, and so now they have to maintain this empire, they have to protect it. And what that means is that now they need new sources of revenue. And they've never taxed internally the British colonists. They've only, in North America, they've only taxed their trade. But now they're gonna have to call upon the colonists to fork over more of what they would consider their share in the governing of their large empire. And when they do this, this is going to lead us down to the road of revolution. And so when the British do this, this is really the end of salutary neglect. Really recall that up until 1763, for the most part, the British had left the colonists alone. They had been able to govern themselves pretty freely, and really the only thing they taxed was trade from coast to coast, but they really didn't tax them internally, and now this is going to change. All right, so that ends the French and Indian War and the impacts thereof. And so our next lecture will be kind of the beginnings of the Revolutionary War.